So I was sent an Atari 130XE by Anthony Ferraro. This is his personal 130XE. He's also the YouTube subscriber that donated the 800XL to the channel that we made the last video about. And he described to me this particular computer having some memory issues. It's failing the memory test during the self-test. So I thought we'd take a look at it for him and make some repairs on it, and at the same time take a look at the 130XE, its history, and some of the nuances about it, and that's what we're going to do. So hang tight. I think you're going to like this video as well. The Atari 130XE is the successor to the most popular Atari selling 8-bit line of computers, which was the 800XL, along with the 600XL and also the 1200XL. Famous Atari owner and CEO Jack Tramiel left Commodore in January 1984, and he was looking to re-enter the market when he purchased the Atari Consumer Division in July 1984 from Warner for an extremely low price. When Tramiel took over, the high-end XL models were canceled, and the low-end XLs were redesigned into the XE series. Now, nearly all of Atari's research, design, and prototype projects were canceled, as is often the nature with new management that are ignorant of the nature of the current projects. This included the Amiga-based 1850 XLD system and other existing 68,000 prototypes, while Tramiel focused on developing the 68,000-based Atari ST system, and also while bringing in ex-Commodore engineers to work on the ST line. You can see that the Atari ST line of computers has a very similar design, almost exact design, as the 130XE. The only difference is the 130XE doesn't have the numerical keyboard next to it, along with the arrow keys separated. It was introduced at the Consumer Electronics Show Winter 1985. And ironically, it was released at the same time as the Atari 520 ST, Atari's introduction into the 16-bit line of processors. The 130XE has the same characteristics as the 800XL, except it's added memory. It's got 128K of memory instead of the 64K that came on the 800XL. The extended memory can be used as a RAM disk, or it can be accessed by bank switching routines. It basically was an attempt to extend the life of the old and aging XL series. Along with the additional memory, it featured an enhanced cartridge interface, which we'll look at a second, and of course a modern, sleek design, very similar to the Atari ST line of computers that would eventually replace it. Along with the new 130XE, Atari introduced the XF551 5¼ floppy disk drive with DOS 2.5. Now, this disk drive was a true double-density, double-sided 5¼ floppy and supported several extended modes for storing extra data on the 5¼ floppy disk. It should also be noted that Sparta DOS, written by ICD, also supports the double-sided, double-density, and enhanced density formats of the XF551. Atari also released an updated cassette recorder, the XC12, with the same stylish look and feel of the new XE series computers. Several other XE machines were also produced at the same time, including the Atari 65XE, which for all intents and purposes is exactly like the 800XL, except it doesn't have a rear parallel connector, which, if you think about it, somewhat limits its expansion capabilities. The Enhanced Cartridge Interface, or ECI, was a modified version of the PBI design, or Parallel Bus Interface, formerly on the 800XL computer. Many of the pins on the PBI were duplicated onto the 30-pin cartridge slot of the 130XE, so the ECI was limited to only those 14 pins in the PBI that were not in the cartridge slot. In 1987, Atari released the Atari ZEGS, or XE game system. Basically, the system was a repackaged Atari 65XE without an extended cartridge interface. With the keyboard, the first and only detachable keyboard for the 8-bit line of computers, was not attached to the system, would come up with Missile Command, which was built into the ROM. When the keyboard was attached, the system would come up with Atari Basic. The system was packaged with console, joystick, light gun, and several software packages, and originally sold for $199. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more demonstrations of what the Atari 8-bit line of computers can do, and also the 130XE with its extended memory. Alright, so now that we've learned a little bit about the 130XE's history and some of what it can do, let's take a look at this 130XE and see if we can figure out what's going on with the memory errors. We'll go ahead and unbox it. Let's get it into the self-test mode and see what kind of memory errors we're getting using the self-test mode. Now this machine is pretty yellowed on the top side of it, but that's okay. That's what happens when these old machines are exposed to the elements over 30 years or so. And here you can see a picture of the 130XE compared to my 130XE and just how bad the yellowing is done to it. But this can be corrected with a retrowriting process, once the computer is repaired. So let's go ahead and turn the 130XE on, and the first thing you'll notice as soon as I turn it on is it goes right to the memory self-test. That is a clear indication that there is one or more of the RAM ICs that are bad, and we'll go ahead and let the memory test run to see how many blocks of the RAM are actually bad. And we can already see some red squares, so that's going to tell us that we've got some bad banks. Now, we don't or we can't tell exactly which ICs are bad by this test. It just tells us that there are some bad banks of memory. So unfortunately, what we have to do is we're going to have to take the computer apart, and we're going to have to figure out which one of the memory ICs is actually bad, or if more than one of them are bad, which is completely possible. Now, to get into the 130XE, we've got to turn it over and remove 4 Phillips head screws from the back, which will allow us to separate the top and bottom and have access to the keyboard connector. Now, once we have the top and bottom separated, the keyboard is basically just connected by a ribbon cable, which you can very carefully just pull straight out. Now, there are 6 screws that are holding the main board to the bottom of the case, and there's also the RF shielding that we're going to have to remove to access the top of the board. Once the 6 screws are removed, the RF shield is basically just held in place with a couple of bent tangs or tabs, if you will. And on this particular 130XE, it doesn't look like it looks like this RF shield has been removed before, because by looking at those tangs, they're already bent straight, which allows me to just basically pull the RF shield straight off without any obstruction. And here we have the main board isolated by itself, and you can see the 16 memory ICs there on the right hand side in the 2 columns. And actually, by looking at the manufacturers, it looks like this particular IC has already been replaced, as it doesn't match the other 17, or I'm sorry, the other 15 that are there. This looks like an NEC D4164C, which is compatible, but it's definitely not the same as the MT4264s that are else on the board. So that would lead me to believe that that IC has already gone bad and been replaced, which would explain why the RF shield came out so easily, because somebody's already been into this computer in the past, you know, outside of the factory. Now, remember back when our test was run, I counted we have 14 red squares, so keep that in mind as we start to troubleshoot the memory chips and replace them once we make an improvement. So right now we've got 14 red squares, and we're going to move on to the procedure that I'm going to show you now on how to troubleshoot and find the bad memory chips. So here we have the 130XE motherboard, and we've got 16 DRAM chips that we're going to actually start to look at in the 2 rows of 8. Now, this procedure involves having some spare memory chips. I happen to have a compatible Samsung IC here. It's a KM4164B, and what you can do is you take these new ICs or DRAM chips, and you want to bend the pins in a little bit so they've got some tension to them. And what we're going to do is we're going to just piggyback, without soldering, this replacement IC on top of the ICs one at a time, just by pushing down on it and letting the legs have tension on the original IC, and that will in effect become the new IC without actually having to remove the old one, if that makes sense. So one at a time, we're going to take this new IC and we're going to position it on top of the questionable IC, and we're going to turn the computer on and see if we get any results. Now, as a little side note, I have already laid the IC on the first chip and it didn't make any changes, but I placed it on the second one, and as you can see, the computer went into basic, which means we made an improvement. Now, I don't know how much of an improvement this one IC is going to make, but we're going to go ahead and let the RAM test run fully and see either if we get all green bars or if we get a reduced number of red bars. My suspicion is going to be we probably improved it to some degree, but I won't know until this RAM test finishes if this is the only bad IC. So let's see what happens. Well, we went from 14 to 6 red squares, so we definitely made an improvement. So now we're just going to continue the process and start to piggyback some of the other ICs and see if we can either eliminate these altogether and get ourselves back with a full positive RAM check. This is a little bit of a closer up view as to what the piggyback IC looks like as you place it on top of each DRAM. You can see that the legs have just enough tension to make contact, but we're obviously not having to solder them or make any permanent connections while we run the tests. So this is a pretty ingenious way to actually test the RAM chips without actually having to desolder 16 chips. Now I went through and did this method on all 16 ICs, and I really didn't see any change in the memory, so I decided that in order to really find out what was going on, I would go ahead and pull the first IC that actually made a difference, which was the second one down in the line from the upper left-hand corner. I decided to go ahead and remove that RAM chip and put in a 16-pin socket. Obviously, anytime you're going to be taking chips off any of these old boards, it's a good idea to go ahead and put a socket in so that in future repairs or upgrades, you don't have to worry about desoldering. These boards are notoriously fragile, especially the 130XEs. The tracings have a bad reputation of tearing and ripping, so it's a good idea to put a socket if you're going to go ahead and do any desoldering. Now, one thing I didn't capture on video, which I should have, is when I started to desolder this IC, the solder wasn't coming out very well. This is, 20, 30-year-old solder, so what I actually had to do off camera was with a pencil retouch all the solder joints with fresh solder, and then that made the desoldering process go a lot smoother. So keep that in mind too when you're working on old electronics. Sometimes it's good to add a little new solder before you try and remove the old solder. Also, after you're done desoldering, do a little cleanup and make sure all the joints have been cleanly desoldered. And then what I always like to do is go with my fingernail and push the pins back and forth. That'll loosen up any remaining little residue of solder that's in there that might hold the IC in there and prevent it from coming out, and thus also ripping a tracing on the board, which is something you don't want to deal with. Now take your time in removing any components from the board. This is a pretty brutal way that I'm working with here at knife, but it does have the right tip that I'm looking for. But if you're doing any prying like I'm doing here, make sure you don't damage the components that are next to the IC. Do very light pressure. You don't want to damage any more components than you have to. So I'm just using a very light pressure here on the corner pin and just working my way back and forth little by little until it finally comes loose. Now when it comes to fitting the socket, again, take your time. Don't apply too much pressure. These pins are very delicate. The sockets themselves are very delicate. You can already see one pin is bent as I try and put it in the first time. So just take your time. Don't force it. Let it go in at its own pace. And then when you get to the desoldering side, you want to do the same thing. Just take your time, do one pin at a time. Make sure you make a good solder joint. And be careful not to damage any of the tracings. Always clean up your joints, make sure it's cleanly soldered, you don't have any dangling solder particles hanging around that could cause a short. And there we have it. We have our new socket right on the board, ready to insert the new memory IC in. Alright, time to go ahead and put our new memory IC in and see what kind of results we get. It's going to be interesting to see if we get the same bad memory blocks or if we made some progress by actually replacing the IC. I have a sneaky suspicion that replacing this IC is going to do a much better job than just letting it ride on top of the old one. Well, apparently our soldering skills are up to par because we're at least at the ready sign. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this keyboard properly, and then we're going to go ahead and run that memory test again. I'll speed it up for you guys and we'll let it do the entire memory bank and see what we have. Well, that looks like a success to me. Well, that just goes to show you that the piggyback method for testing the memory can point you in the right direction, but it doesn't always give you the absolute result you're looking for. So I would suggest if you're using this method on your own, as soon as you see a change in any of the memory testing for whatever machine you're working on, go ahead and replace that IC and then continue your testing. Because obviously doing the piggyback method, there's still some errors you could get based on the fact that that bad chip is still part of the circuit, even though you have a good chip on top of it. So anyway, you guys get to watch me put the 130XC back together. So let's go ahead and give it a final test, make sure that everything works by playing some Donkey Kong. I hope you guys liked the video. If you do, give me some comments. If there's some questions you have about what I did to the 130XC, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and I've got some other stuff coming up here shortly. Some more assembly language programming videos and the such. So anyway, I recommend everybody get out there and restore some retro hardware. It's really fun to do, and we got to keep these machines going. So until the next video, take care everybody. Go Atari.